Welcome to the last of Fellows Talk of this calendar year, but not, of course, of the academic year, because we have a full slate of talks coming up. Before I mention some or introduce our speakers, I want to begin by, of course, welcoming you to the Humanities Institute. I'm the director, Michael Lynch. And at this moment, when many of us are working in different places and meeting remotely, we acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are gathered and of the lands where remote participants are currently working. We recognize their continuing connection to the land, the waters, and culture, and we pay our respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. To make sure that you always know what we have planned at the Institute, you can follow us on social media, subscribe to our listserv and our monthly newsletter, and of course, if you're looking to make a tax-deductible donation before the holidays, feel free to go to our giving page and do so. You can find all these things on our website, humanities.uconn.edu. Shiloh Whitney, our speaker for today, is an associate professor of philosophy at Fordham University, and her research lies at the intersection of feminist philosophy, critical phenomenology, and the philosophy of emotions. She writes on a wide variety of topics at that intersection, and including on figures ranging from merleau-ponty to phenomenon. She's currently working on a book, Emotional Labor and Affective Injustice. Ina Ziering is a English PhD candidate. She is our commentator for today and a graduate dissertation fellow at the Institute. She has completed her graduate certificates in American Studies and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, and her teaching and research center on the intersectional feminist questions of racial and gender justice in 20th century American literature and culture. Without further ado, I welcome Shiloh to the stage.
Thank you so much for being here today. I'm really happy to see every one of you. I also want to thank everyone who spent time talking to me about these topics over the last couple of months, both folks here at UConn and folks at Fordham and various interlocutors near and far. Thank you so much. You know who you are. So I came here to write a book about emotional labor and affective injustice. And what I'm mainly going to talk about today is the affective injustice side of things. So in this first section, I'm going to give you an overview. I'm going to tell you kind of where I started and where that led me. And in the subsequent sections, we'll unpack the details. So I started with a case. I started with the case of anger gaslighting, a case of affective injustice. So this is anger gaslighting. What's anger gaslighting? So gaslighting is a behavior that tends to make its target doubt herself. Anger gaslighting is a behavior that tends to make its target doubt herself about the aptness of her anger. So what I wanted to do with this, modestly, the first goal was just to argue that gaslighting can be an affective injustice and use anger gaslighting as a sort of paradigm case to do that. So there's a conversation about gaslighting that's going on in feminist philosophy right now, and it tends to focus on treating it as an epistemic injustice, right? Some injustice that's related to knowledge and credibility. I wanted to intervene in that conversation and argue that gaslighting can be an affective injustice, an injustice that's related to emotions and affective influence. And the idea was to take anger gaslighting as a kind of paradigm case. But then I started to think that maybe that was a little too easy, and I got more ambitious. So my more ambitious goal was actually to use anger gaslighting as a paradigm case for analyzing affective injustice more broadly. So I'm interested in this larger category of affective injustice. I think there's this whole dimension of injustice that operates in our affective responses to each other. And ultimately, I was hoping that studying this paradigm case was going to reveal some categories for engaging with affective injustice beyond just the case of anger gaslighting. So where that led me was to the concept of uptake. This is a second person affective behavior. It's about how I react to somebody else's affective behavior rather than just how I feel myself. And ultimately to this category of uptake injustice. So a category of injustices, of affective injustices that concerns giving or refusing uptake to other people's affects. That includes the case of anger gaslighting, but isn't limited to it. So put uptake injustice on our handy little diagram here. I want to think about uptake injustice as this category of affective injustice that I found through studying this case of anger gaslighting. So I started with the case of anger gaslighting. That leads me to uptake injustice. So what are we going to do today? Well, I'm going to take you through that case of anger gaslighting, and I'm going to show you what's unjust about it and why it matters. And I'm going to develop the concept of uptake as a tool for understanding that paradigm case, for being able to sort of identify anger gaslighting, see what's going on with it, what's wrong with it. And then I'm going to try and convince you that uptake injustice is an important category of affective injustice. And I'm going to do that by trying to demonstrate its usefulness beyond that paradigm case of anger gaslighting, and arguing that uptake actually matters for justice beyond the ways that the paradigm case, anger gaslighting, matters. And environmental despair and empathy, I'll explain what that is when we get to it, those come up as cases that are a kind of proof of concept that sort of show how uptake works. So the main thing I want to that I want you to take away today is this, that uptake injustice is an important category of affective injustice. That's the big thing that I want you to get when you walk out of the room today. So let's get down to it. So anger gaslighting, what is it? So when a person is successfully gaslit, they're not just doubted by other people. They actually start to doubt themselves. And the latter is accomplished by way of the former. So casting doubt on somebody is a way to make her doubt herself. So in the feminist conversation, there's been a focus on thinking about the epistemic dimension of this, the way that persistently casting doubt on the credibility of my testimony can tend to make me second guess my experiences and my beliefs. But I wanted to think about the affective dimension of this. I wanted to think about the way that persistently casting doubt on my emotional competency can tend to make me second guess the aptness of my affective responses. There's actually precedent in the psychological literature for thinking about it that way, but that hasn't kind of come up yet in the conversation of philosophy. So notice that the effect of this is not only going to be that my emotion doesn't move other people appropriately, right? My affective responses themselves might be impaired. So if anger, for instance, is a response to insult or injury, then when anger gaslighting is successful, when I'm sort of completely gaslit about my anger, then the spontaneity and the conviction of that response can be impaired. Okay, so here's what that anger gaslighting effect looks like. So Gloria Steinem, I could finally tell people on a Thursday that I'd been angry on a Monday. I couldn't tell them in real time. This is Soraya Chemily writing in 2018. Anger was so effectively severed from my use that instead of being a catalyst for change, feeling angry invalidated both my confidence and my own experiences. And here's Leslie Jameson. For years, I described myself as someone who wasn't prone to anger. I don't get angry, I said, I get sad. At a certain point, I started to suspect that I was angrier than I thought. So that's the phenomenon that I have in mind. And I'm hoping that these quotes give you some reason to think that anger gaslighting is real, it's a thing, and that it's a feminist issue. So these are, in case you want to read more, so these are 3 books that helped me to get the sort of phenomenon of anger gaslighting in view. They all came out in 2018. They're all about women's anger, and they're all about the things that have been done to try and stop it, but also how much it's accomplished. So very excellent books. 2018 was a great year for women's anger. And yes, maybe this year will be too. So yes, anger gaslighting, why does it matter? So here I want to give you some reasons to think that anger gaslighting matters. Well, first of all, it's relevant. Anger gaslighting is this uniquely relevant case because anger is urgently contested territory in our political landscape. Whose anger is going to be taken seriously and direct our collective conversation toward its objects? And whose anger is going to be treated as a tantrum, to be contained, to be disciplined, right? How are we going to treat the sort of angers of insubordination, the ones that punch up, or those angers of aggrieved entitlement that punch down? These abound in our political situation right now. But I think also that anger matters in ways that are not so contingent on the mood of the times. And to understand that, we have to look a little bit at the moral psychology of anger, what its role is in our moral and political apparatus. I think that anger has a moral function. So anger gaslighting matters because it can lead us to doubt ourselves in ways that sabotage that unique and important moral and political function. It can actually impair our abilities, not just to sort of register injustice, but also to take a forceful stand against it. So what's this moral and political function? Well, first of all, anger has a role in our moral perception. So just as fear is our sense of alarm and grief is our sense of loss, anger is our sense of injustice. So it's an important part of our moral compass. And in making us second guess our anger gaslighting spins that moral compass, it disorients it. And that makes anger gaslighting this uniquely powerful tool of subordination. Also, anger has a role to play in moral motivation and action, right? Anger motivates action, but anger is itself already an action. Anger makes demands. So in denouncing a wrongdoing and a wrongdoer, an angry response claims status and it demands respect, right? Anger says, that was wrong, I was wronged, but it also says, you wronged me, you shouldn't treat me that way, I deserve better. So anger gaslighting threatens our capacity to stand up for ourselves in that way. Anger also has this function as a moral and political influence. Anger is a way of directing attention toward wrongdoing, toward wrongdoers, and it doesn't just direct my attention as the person who's angry, it directs other people's attention. Anger influences other people, at least at the level of directing their attention. So anger gaslighting is this tool for making anger's attention directing function backfire, right? Redirecting attention away from what I'm angry about and onto scrutiny of me and my emotional state instead. So another way to think about how anger gaslighting matters, Soraya Chemily writes, the dynamic of who gets to express anger matters in all unequal social relationships. So anger is a feminist issue. It's not a one-dimensional feminist issue. No feminist issues are. But because of anger's unique moral and political function, anger gaslighting is this uniquely versatile, multi-purpose tool of subordination. Race, class, age, those are all sites of anger gaslighting. They also ramify the ways that gender is a site of it. And I think ultimately, as Chemily says here, right, this dynamic of who gets to express anger is going to matter in any unequal relationship. Status and respect and injustice, those things are uniquely at stake in anger. And so for me, it's also that looking at that moral psychology of anger shows us that, yes, anger gaslighting is important in its own right, but it also shows us that anger gaslighting is this uniquely instructive paradigm case. If we want to understand how emotions can be weaponized in social power struggles, this is a great place to start. So here are some feminist philosophers who wrote about why anger matters and have been particularly influential for me. Okay, so we've talked now about what the effects of anger gaslighting look like and why they matter. So now I need to look at what the behavior of anger gaslighting looks like. What is it? How are we going to recognize it? How are we going to identify it? And this is going to take me to this notion of uptake. All right, so here are two descriptions of anger gaslighting behavior. Alicia Garza, Black women's anger gets dismissed and devalued and gaslighted. We get told all the time that our anger is disruptive, that it's a distraction, that it's divisive. Nobody ever seems to ask this question, why are you so fucking mad? 35 years earlier, Marilyn Frye, a feminist philosopher, says, it's a tiresome truth of women's experience that our anger is generally not well received. Attention is turned, not to what we are angry about, but to the project of calming us down and to the topic of our mental stability. It's as common as dirty socks. Our anger is deprived of uptake. So 35 years apart, similar descriptions of the behavior. Anger gaslighters don't pay attention to what I'm angry about. Instead, they change the subject, they turn their attention to my emotional state, and they cast doubt on whether I'm regulating my emotions properly. So Marilyn Frye called that depriving anger of uptake, right? This second person phenomenon that's about how I react to somebody else's affective behavior. So let's take a closer look at uptake. So uptake is something that can be given and can be refused. Giving uptake directs your attention to my anger's object, what I'm angry about. Refusing uptake backfires that attention directing force. Instead of moving me to attend to its object, my anger moves you, instead of moving you to attend to its object, my anger moves you to attend to me as this sort of emotional person. Looking a little more closely at giving uptake doesn't necessarily mean that you agree with what my anger demands. You don't have to agree that my anger is apt or proportionate or fitting. We could disagree, we could have a debate about that. But if we have a debate about that, if we have that conversation, you've given uptake to my anger, right? The basic function of the anger has been accomplished. It communicated its message, it conveyed its attention directing force. We're now talking about what I'm angry about. Refusing uptake is treating my anger as if it's not about anything in the outside world. Maybe it fixates on some objects, but it doesn't really have anything meaningful to say about them because it's not really a response to them. It's a response to something, some disturbance here, some psychological or physical disturbance inside me. It's this outburst that bears on nothing in the world we share. That's what refusing uptake does. Then my anger hasn't been accomplished. It hasn't communicated a message. Its attention directing force has backfired. So I started to ask at this point, and I'll make a note about it, about whether refusing uptake is sometimes appropriate. And I think that refusing uptake is sometimes appropriate. Tantrums and outbursts are real things. And it's not only children who have them. Sometimes our emotional competencies are miscalibrated, sometimes they're impaired, sometimes they're biased, sometimes they're undercultivated. But interestingly, as the phenomenon of anger gaslighting itself shows, what supports or impairs our emotional competencies aren't always contained inside the agitated person, right? Maybe we can distinguish uptake refusals that backfire attention onto the emotional person, and maybe we can think about uptake refusals that attend deeper to sort of what supports or impairs emotional competency. In any case, we can define anger gaslighting behavior in terms of refused uptake. So persistent, pervasive refusal of uptake for apt anger, either in general or with respect to some domain, is going to be anger gaslighting behavior. Okay, so now we've got this concept of uptake on the table. It's helped us to clarify what anger gaslighting behavior is. And in this section, I want to demonstrate that uptake injustice is bigger than just anger gaslighting. Right now, we want to break it open a little bit and get into uptake injustice more broadly. Right, so again, this picture, I want to get out of just the anger gaslighting case and find ways from there into uptake injustice more broadly. So if uptake is a scalable category of affective injustice, then I should be able to sort of zoom in and distinguish some more finely grained uptake injustices that are related to the case of anger gaslighting. And I should also be able to zoom out and identify some other kinds of uptake injustices that exceed the parameters of the anger gaslighting case altogether. So let's try and do that. So zooming in, anger gaslighting behavior turns out to produce uptake injustices even when it fails to gaslight the target. So persistent anger uptake refusal can cause these more finely grained varieties of uptake injustice, even if the target never actually gets to the point where she doubts herself about the aptness of her anger, even if she's able to sort of resist those stronger gaslighting effects. I thought about a bunch of different ones. I'm just going to share kind of two here. One, anger muting and backfiring, which sort of go together, and another that I called anger swallowing. So muting and backfiring, refusing uptake mutes anger's message and backfires its force. Those are direct results of anger gaslighting behaviors, but what's unjust about them exceeds that tendency to gaslight. So even if the target never doubts herself about her anger, persistently refusing uptake sabotages her anger's capacity to demand respect and influence others, even if gaslighting isn't what's wrong with it in this case, in the sense that she has come to doubt herself about the aptness of her anger. There's still something that's gone wrong, and that concept of uptake helps us to understand what that is. So, trying to put it on the map here, the way that these, like what's unjust about that injurious effect of persistent anger uptake refusal goes beyond its tendency to gaslight. All right, anger swallowing. We often adapt to uptake refusal by swallowing our anger in anticipation of it. That's a byproduct of anger gaslighting behaviors. But what's unjust about it exceeds that tendency to gaslight. And anger swallowing is an interesting one because that's an adaptive response to a kind of non-choice worthy situation. It's a strategic choice. It's an expression of your agency. It's not intrinsically injurious to regulate your anger in that way. But frequently swallowing apt anger can become toxic. And the pervasive demand to do it is unjust. Because again, that's going to sabotage your anger's capacity to make demands, to influence others, even if the target never doubts herself about the aptness of her anger. Putting that on the map too. Okay, so now I want to sort of zoom out and give you more reasons why uptake injustice is bigger than gaslighting. Move beyond the parameters of the anger gaslighting case altogether. So I think uptake can be unjustly given, not just unjustly refused. So I'm going to give you Kate Mann's notion of sympathy as an example of this. So Kate Mann says, I define sympathy as the inappropriate or outsized sympathy extended to male perpetrators of misogyny and sexual violence over their female victims, who are often erased in the process. Sympathy means worrying about his bright future, not her suffering. So we can understand sympathy in terms of uptake. Sympathy is this bi-directional uptake injustice, unjustly giving uptake to the anger, distress, or fear of powerful men who get caught harming women, and unjustly refusing uptake to the anger, distress, or fear of the women that they harm. So sympathy is something that's going to produce gaslighting almost as a byproduct, right? The unjustly refusing is a byproduct of the unjustly giving. But interestingly, of course, it produces gaslighting, but what's wrong with it isn't just the gaslighting stuff. The problem is additional. And we might actually, it's interesting to think about an inverse of anger gaslighting. I'm not totally committed to this term anger coddling, but I kind of like it, right? Like this term for sort of this inflated and overindulgent way that you give uptake to somebody's affect, never questioning their emotional competency, even when maybe you should. So we'll put sympathy on our diagram. Okay, so let's zoom out in a different direction. Uptake injustice is bigger than refusing uptake, but it's also bigger than anger. We can give or refuse uptake to a variety of different affects, and those, in at least some cases, are going to have stakes for social justice too. So this one, I'll give you this example. First, fear uptake injustice. I think fear too is something that can be unjustly given and unjustly refused uptake. Here's Brittany Cooper. White fears are routinely treated as fact rather than fantasy. Everyone who's non-white is treated as though their fears are the stuff of fantasy, right? Are you sure that's really racist? Right? I don't know. Like, I think your sense of alarm is going off. Are you sure that cop is following you? I don't know. Maybe there's another, maybe your ex isn't really stalking, right? Like there are ways that we can be gaslit about fear. If anger is our sense of injustice, but fear is our sense of alarm, I think that sense of alarm too can be gaslit. And that can have a moral and political function. But we can also have fear coddling, right? The unjust giving of uptake for fear, as well as the unjust refusing of it. So yeah, and like the unjust giving. So on the one hand, fear gaslighting, unjustly refusing uptake, right? That wasn't racist, you're just paranoid. But on the other side, unjustly giving it, well, the officer said he feared for his life, and I'm not going to ask questions about whether his sense of alarm is informed by racist perception biases in ways that impair his fear emotional competency. Here's another one, environmental despair. So environmental despair and ecological grief, this is another urgently relevant case of affective gaslighting. So environmental despair gaslighters refuse uptake. So instead of turning attention to the urgent objects that these affects are responding to, they make the person's emotional state itself the object of concern. They target it for tone policing, be more upbeat, they ridicule, maybe they target their emotional state as a sort of object of psychological treatment, you're just depressed. So if despair is our sense of a closing future and grief is our sense of loss, those are increasingly apt affective responses to climate crisis and mass extinction. And interestingly, even people who don't deny the facts of climate crisis don't always aptly affectively register it and may refuse uptake to people who do. So there's something that is really intriguing me about these environmental affects, right? Emphasizing uptake highlights environmental affective injustices that exceed that gaslighting case. I can find a case of gaslighting there, but there's more going on with affective injustice there, and looking at it in terms of uptake helps some of that stuff to come to the surface. So it points out this uniquely affective form of climate crisis denial, right? Even when we don't deny the facts, we can still fail to aptly affectively register climate crisis. It also points to a uniquely affective form of environmental justice work that involves giving uptake to these really difficult environmental affects, right? Managing our attention in accordance with them. And of course, there's also overlap with the paradigm case of anger gaslighting. Environmental justice too can be an object of anger, and we can be gaslit about that anger. And that is a response that happens, especially when environmental activists are young and are women. So we put environmental uptake issues on our map here too. Okay, so just to recap this section, because we covered a lot of ground. So anger gaslighting behavior produces uptake injustices even when it fails to gaslight, like the anger swallowing, muting, backfiring stuff. In gaslighting, uptake is unjustly refused, but it can also be unjustly given. So sympathy and anger and fear coddling were examples of that. While anger is this uniquely important moral and political emotion, uptake matters for other emotions as well. So fear and environmental despair were examples there. So uptake injustice goes beyond anger gaslighting. Hopefully I've given you some reasons to think that. Uptake is a valuable category for understanding affective injustice beyond the paradigm case. Hopefully I've given you some reasons to think that too. But in this section, I kind of demonstrated that in this piecemeal way, using these particular examples. And in the next section, I want to do, and this will be the last substantive section, and we'll go by quicker, I promise. I want to do that in a more kind of top-down systematic way. So uptake rules, mapping power and making power. I like the idea that uptake rules is actually, so it's a noun phrase, rules that concern uptake, but it's also a sentence with a subject and a verb. Uptake rules. Yeah? No? Okay. That's a laugh to get through the last section. Okay, so uptake rules, mapping power and making power. So sociologists talk about feeling rules. These are social norms and expectations that prescribe first-person affective behavior. Which emotions are appropriate for me to feel, toward whom, when, with respect to what, et cetera. So I think studying uptake suggests that we should introduce this new category of feeling rules, uptake rules. So social norms and expectations that prescribe second-person affective behavior, how one reacts to the affective behavior of somebody else. Sociologists talk about feeling rules functioning as a demand for a certain kind of emotional work, managing our emotions to induce or suppress the relevant feeling, right? I try to be happy at the wedding, I try to be sad at the funeral. But studying uptake suggests that we should introduce a new category of emotional work. Uptake rules function as a demand for this other kind of emotional work that's about managing our attention to give or to refuse uptake. Okay, so I need this notion of uptake rules because I want to think about how uptake injustices like anger gaslighting and like empathy work in a structural way, right, as part of large-scale social injustices. So I want to think about the way that those uptake injustices can function as a set of background conditions that tend to produce those unjust effects even when deliberate intent is absent, right? I don't have to mean to gaslight you. Anger gaslighting can be this background structural effect. So if that's so, then it would be because there are uptake rules that demand uptake in accordance with social hierarchies, right? They condition whether and how that attention directing force of our affects lands in accordance with social hierarchies. You give uptake to the angers of aggrieved entitlement, and you refuse uptake to the angers of insubordination. So Marilyn Fry makes this really fascinating comment that tracking anger uptake is an instrument of cartography, she writes. She says, if we track whose anger gets uptake from whom, with respect to what, in what domain, that's going to give us a map of social hierarchies. That's a fascinating claim. It makes anger uptake this really interesting tool for tracking intersectional power dynamics. Super interesting. I think we can draw an even bolder conclusion. I think uptake distribution doesn't just map power, it shapes the territory. It raises the mountains, it lowers the valleys. I mean, not all on its own, but has a role in that. So I think that giving and refusing uptake is not just an instrument of cartography, it's an instrument of power. Right? It doesn't just reflect social hierarchies, it's one of the ways that they're made. And I think that's so not just for anger uptake, but I think that's so for any emotion with a sort of second person attention directing force. There's going to be a lot of them. I'm not sure if it's all. But yeah, so we can make an argument for that uptake makes power from that notion of uptake rules. If uptake rules condition that attention directing force of our affective responses, then uptake rules and that attention management work, the uptake work that they demand, function as partly constitutive of large-scale social injustices like racism and sexism, environmental injustice. So then giving and refusing uptake doesn't just reflect social hierarchies, it plays a role in constituting them. But that also means that uptake work can be the site of affective activism. So we can break feeling rules, right? The anger of subordinates at those who are placed above them is an act of insubordination. We can also decide to break uptake rules, right? Refusing uptake to the angers of aggrieved entitlement and giving uptake to the angers of insubordination. That too, those two are acts of insubordination. I'm not going to talk through these. I put through a couple other examples, things that might be cases of uptake insubordination that are interesting to think about. So we went through some ground in this section too, going over it quickly. Uptake rules are an important category of social feeling rules that can produce uptake injustices like anger gaslighting as a sort of background structural condition. It doesn't have to be deliberately perpetrated. Anger uptake maps social hierarchies, but giving and refusing uptake is partly constitutive of those hierarchies. So breaking social feeling rules about anger can be an important form of affective activism. So can breaking uptake rules. Giving or refusing uptake can be this powerful act of insubordination. So I'm hoping that that gives you a reason to think that uptake matters for justice beyond the ways that anger gaslighting matters. So affective injustice, from anger gaslighting to environmental despair. I've taken you on that journey. This is the thing that I want you to take away from it. Uptake injustice is an important category of affective injustice. There's the diagram of what that looks like again. I took you through that case of anger gaslighting and why I think it matters, developed that concept of uptake as a tool for understanding it, and then we moved into uptake injustice. I showed you its usefulness beyond the paradigm case, and that uptake matters beyond the ways that the paradigm case matters. Okay, so I love to hear about cases of affective injustice or emotional work or affective activism that matter to you. Please, email me and give me your interesting cases, whether the concept of uptake helps you understand them or not. I'd love to hear about them. Thank you so much for your attention. So thank you so much, Shiloh. I'm sure I'm not the only one who's going to go home tonight and think about all those times that I was anger gaslit that I didn't even realize until this talk. So thank you for that activity for tonight. I've had the privilege of hearing a lot of iterations of this research over the course of the semester as part of the working group, and I've asked many of my questions there. I'm sure many of you are excited to engage with this work, so I'm going to try to keep it on the brief side so we can get to you. I want to start by just saying that what I love about this project is the way that it takes something uniquely personal, interior, and sometimes even invisible, and illuminates it as this systemic and structural issue. I think it's really exemplary interdisciplinary work, bringing philosophy to bear on gender studies, psychology, sociology, and intersectional issues across the board. And it also takes this now popular concept of gaslighting, and it resituates it in an intellectual genealogy that I think it has been to some degree severed from in the popular discourse. It offers new high-level theoretical applications for the idea, and it does all of that without sacrificing the accessibility that the concept has gained in the public. So I think that's really just public humanities work at its finest too. So you're doing something really interesting here with the connection between knowledge and feeling. Epistemic and affective injustices, right? And I think those categories of knowing and feeling have obviously been gendered for a long time in some pretty obvious ways. Women feel, and that matters less. Men know, and that matters more. And you seem to be going against that grain, not only in your argument, but in the path you took to get there. You mentioned that feminist philosophy has already engaged gaslighting as an epistemic injustice, but then you make a new turn toward gaslighting as an affective injustice. And I think there's something really powerful about that movement from knowledge to feeling, rather than assuming that once we've gotten to knowledge, we've gotten to the end, right? The hierarchy has been completed. I think that's a subtle argument going on within this work, and I really appreciate it. More overtly, you focus on anger explicitly because of its practical potential. So what you call its unique and important moral and political functions. And those functions are conceived, as I understand them, as the effect of anger's potential to register injustice and direct people's attention toward the objects of anger. You also mentioned a series of other affects like fear, despair, and grief, and you outline how they also call direct attention to objects. So I'm curious, first, as to whether you think all affects can be subject to uptake injustice beyond gaslighting, or whether uptake injustice depends on an affect having an external important object. If a more internally oriented affect is refused uptake, like excitement or shame or pleasure, I'm curious about whether you think those refusals actually constitute uptake injustice or maybe just uptake denial. And this question is deeply connected for me to the idea of the tantrum. And I'd love to hear how you define a tantrum and any guidelines you might have for how we can identify one in practice. I didn't realize that was funny, but I'm so glad that it was. So in our working group, you mentioned the example of a child who was angry because they didn't have water. And then you got them water, or somebody got them water, and then they were angry because they had too much water. So in that case, it seems that a tantrum is defined by a constantly shifting or even paradoxical object of anger. So the refusal of uptake in that case is just because the shift indicates that the anger is not about the object, it is in fact about the emotional state of the angry person. I'm curious in that case, whether we can call that affect anger at all, if anger is defined by having these moral and political implications meant to direct us toward an object, or whether we need a word like frustration or irritation or whatever it may be to describe that. And I bring up this question because the word tantrum makes me nervous. I think it carries age and gendered connotations of emotionality, despite how we might be re-theorizing it. And it worries me that although you are certainly not doing this, that the presence of the word in the discourse, as we saw with the pictures of Greta Thunberg and Brett Kavanaugh, could be used to sustain that injustice in particular ways. I was also wondering whether you could give us an example of a time when affect was given uptake and effectively mobilized in the face of systemic injustice. I've been thinking about this, and probably unsurprisingly, my mind keeps going to pandemics. So you mentioned Alicia Garza and the epidemics of racism and police brutality. I've also been thinking of the way that groups like ACT UP mobilized affect in the face of apathy during the 1980s AIDS crisis, but also how the white LGBT community in the US has largely left that affect behind, right? AIDS is still an issue, more so now, maybe in sub-Saharan Africa or Asia or the Pacific, and in the US on communities of color, but that anger, right, which was effective at some point, has been sort of let slide. And in that case, I think we see a literal example of what you're talking about at the end of uptake injustice not only reflecting, but in fact creating a map, and in this case, a map of illness and fatality. So if we're not giving uptake to cases of anger in sub-Saharan Africa, that is in fact resulting in literal death. And I think we saw something similar happening, especially during the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic, where the spread of the disease, especially before vaccines, revealed and reinscribed maps of social valuation. Even as cultural waves of gratitude were either manufactured or maybe more charitably generated for essential workers, that affect served as a distraction for the long-standing social cartography that underlaid that map of the essential worker category, and that continued to worsen the sort of cartographies that you were discussing. And now we're seeing the same thing happen again as the pandemic is maybe sort of somewhat coming under control in the United States. There's less attention to the ways that the disease is spreading in other parts of the world. So I'd love to hear of other examples or situations that might be sort of in the back or the front of your mind. And then my last question, I'm curious about the ways that we might conceive of uptake and uptake injustice when they're not interpersonal. So what you talked about largely was you are angry, I give uptake or not. But particularly, again, as COVID has changed the ways that we interact with people, I'm wondering about how it is a phenomenon that can function at a distance, this uptake phenomenon. And I was actually thinking a lot about Sarah's project and the Pandemic Journaling Project as a great way of giving uptake to this anger in a structural fashion. So I'm wondering how or whether we need to adjust our understanding of uptake when it's taking place or not taking place through, for instance, the selection of news outlets that you read in the morning, or how you engage with social media. What does it mean to give uptake, say to retweet something when that uptake is disconnected from in-person interactions? And does that sort of distant social media uptake work direct attention to the anger's object, or then do we slide into that sort of dicey territory of Facebook activism, which is maybe more about performance and self-congratulation than actual action in the wake of uptake? I know that's not that's still a debatable concept, but just toss it out there. So I'm going to stop there, and I hope that you'll feel free to address or ignore those ideas as you see fit. I'm really grateful for the chance to engage with your work today and over the course of the year. I feel like I've learned a lot from you as a scholar and an interlocutor and a community member. You've been very generous, and I look forward to everyone's questions.
I really want to hear everyone else's responses, and so I'm very torn because you asked amazing questions, and now I want to give you a whole other talk. So I can't really do that at all. So I will try not to. So the last two things where you're talking about uptake at a distance and epidemics and how uptake worked in ACT UP, but then also thinking about how uptake has been working in COVID and also breaking down in various ways. That's just an amazing case. Like you're taking this concept and doing awesome things with it. And I am so interested and excited about the connections that you're making there. But I'm not going to try and add anything to those right now. The other two, I feel like I should respond to a little bit. So the first one about internally oriented affects and whether uptake refusal of those might constitute an injustice. So I'm using the word injustice here in this pretty sloppy way, right? I'm not actually committing to any particular theory of justice. I'm just saying, okay, there are certain phenomena that are social and historical that we acknowledge, that we call injustices, racism, sexism, coloniality, right? Like and I'm thinking about, I'm thinking about something counting as an injustice when I can see that it is functionally constitutive in some way of those phenomena. So really, I think, so can shame, for instance, play a role? Absolutely, right? And in fact, I actually think that shame, when we start talking about internally oriented affects, right? Like I myself is the object of shame. I am ashamed of myself, right? Shame is a sense of myself. But that doesn't mean it's totally internally oriented, right? Like shame is this fundamentally second person affect. I am ashamed of myself before you, right? I am ashamed of myself. If you're Sartrean, then you think shame just is me having this experience of myself from the second person, from the outside. I think that, anyway, I won't try and go off into giving you an analysis of shame for the purposes of this. But that's just one of the things to say is that you will have to give a kind of piecemeal, you will have to do the work of thinking, how does uptake matter? Maybe it doesn't matter for every affect. I mean, I think like shame, you might think shame is partly constituted of uptake, that shame is a kind of, that shame is partly made up of a kind of uptake for contempt, right? Like shame is this sense of myself as a contemptible object. Maybe not a particular present person's contempt, but an anticipated, I don't know, like I'm riffing at this point, but like how uptake is going to count, gratitude might be uptake for generosity to some extent, right? Like how uptake matters is going to matter differently depending on the moral psychology, the political phenomenology of the affect. Pleasure is such an interesting example. We're always trying to depoliticize pleasure, right? We're always trying to move that, for better and for worse. And so I don't know, I think that you have to give a sort of piecemeal answer to that, but it's such an interesting answer in everything. The tantrum question, I almost feel like I can't say anything about because there's not enough time to say anything about it. Here's the one thing that I'm gonna say, which is, okay, a tantrum, quick and dirty, right? Like when the object of the anger and the cause of the anger have come apart, right? Anger isn't an apt response to the cause anyway, right? Like I'm screaming about the sippy cup and which color it was, or whether you were standing or sitting when you gave it to me, because I'm tired, right? And that cause is different from the object. It could have almost any object, right? The cause and the object have come apart. But also anger wasn't an apt response to that cause to begin with. Right? Like anger isn't a good response to being tired. And we learn that as we get older. However, okay, I said I wasn't gonna say anything about it. The question is, what's the right response? Right? What's the right response? Is refusing uptake in the way I described it here, is that the right response? Or do we end up gaslighting our kids about their emotions when we do that, right? Like, I don't know. There's a deep, deep well of things, and I have so many things to say about it, and I will talk to you about it later.
Just quick add, I think that you don't talk about this, I don't know anything about it, but my sister just kindergarten, and I know that there's a big focus right now on that kind of social emotional learning, right? And what do you do with a 5-year-old who's mad about probably not a sippy cup if you're 5? I'm not sure like your snack. What do you do with that, and how do you help them?
Yeah. What is the way? So it's fine if there's an emotional incompetency that's real. Then yeah, it's wrong to just give uptake and talk about the object. No, you actually do need to pay enough attention. But what does it look like to not give uptake, to refuse uptake in a way that is actually about cultivating the emotional competency and not just about like being like, well, you're a mess,
Right, great. So Anna, do you want to field the questions?
So as you were talking, and you said you were trying to figure out if it applies to every emotion or, what are the limitations of this paradigm with particular emotions. I was trying to figure out of like a totalizing institution that would involve every emotion so that you could test your case. And I came up with the institution of slavery. right? Because it's built around an entire system of uptake and justice, where every realm from enslaved people's fear, grief, capacity to love, to feel shame, like every possible like emotional register involves some kind of uptake injustice for the overall structure of the institution of slavery to work. And in terms of the kind of work that abolitionists wanted to do for the public to register and sympathize with enslaved people's cause, it was to try to get us to think about Black women being separated from their children, or being sold away from their families, or being ripped from their homes. So I just kind of wanted to ask you if you think that's the kind of institution that could get you to think about the entire arc of emotion, including love and other things that you haven't brought up in your paradigm.
So thank you so much for that comment. I think that you've said some things in the last couple of weeks too that have made me think about this too, right? The refusing uptake to love, the idea that you might be able to be gaslit about love or maternal affection, or I don't know, they're absolutely fascinating things to pursue in this direction. I think that man, you can talk about slavery as an uptake injustice. There's no doubt about that. I think there are a lot of different registers that you can talk about the injustices. Yeah, like it's certainly not the only one. It could be an important one that has, maybe it's an important one that's been neglected. I think though that ultimately, it's not that I'm looking for, I'm actually not looking for a sort of master case that lets me find every emotion. I think actually, so what's going on in my head right now is that I'm really interested in the way that there are also affective injustices that aren't uptake injustices at all, that actually need different concepts to address them. And actually, if I spent the hour responding to the tantrum comment, it would go there. Anyway, so yeah, I appreciate that, and I'm going to think about that. But I also am hesitant to make the move where I'm like, where's the overarching case where I can find all of the, like, find a bunch of uptake injustices together. I'm not sure that methodologically that's what I want to do right now.
Yeah. Okay, so this is from Miriam Ambrosino. She says, "Thank you, Shiloh, for such a wonderful and stimulating talk. What is the way you imagine affective injustice relating to hermeneutic injustice? For example, as you say, an emotion like anger makes a claim on others and directs their attention to what my anger is responding to. Anger also supports the way a situation is disclosed or how it is interpreted. Someone who denies this anger uptake may refuse to see my anger as having an object, or they may see what the object of this anger is disclosed to me as. Is this refusal of uptake mediated by a hermeneutic injustice, or perhaps the other way around? Are these distinct moments?"
I don't know. I know that I think Miriam, you've been reading or talking to Ellie Anderson, probably, who does this work on hermeneutic work. And yeah, this is a whole, there's a whole other set of things to discuss there. How is it that certain affects become legible or not? What are the skills that it takes to sort of read them? You know, the only thing that what I've done today has to offer that in particular, I think, is the idea that uptake rules can condition the legibility of different affects in different people in different domains, etc. But I think that's an important set of things that I don't actually have a lot of stuff to give you about right now.
I was thinking about a little flip on the argument. But you might already do that in the book, in the longer work, so forgive me, I haven't read them. But there are situations of anger actually about justice. In other words, in certain systems where there's an effort to move from injustice to justice, there are two layers. And if one, it would be an important element for the person who's angered at justice, actually to receive doubt about what supports their position that maintain the injustice. So the two parts are, one, does that count as gaslighting? And two, isn't there also a form of obligation for that doubt to be instilled in that individual?
Yeah. Yeah, so absolutely what you call anger at justice. I mean, so I would say, anger takes its object to be an injustice. It's not always correct about that, right? Like, anger is my sense of injustice, but the sense can misfire. I can mishear too, but that doesn't mean, well, anyway. So yes, so in that sense, something that is actually, and we see this all the time, right? This is what I call the angers of aggrieved entitlement, right? Demands, egalitarian demands for justice are experienced by people who have enjoyed the privilege of whatever hierarchy is being challenged as injustice, right? Experienced as they feel victimized by those. And the response is anger, right? And that, absolutely. So I would call that an anger of aggrieved entitlement. And yeah, I think it's right to refuse uptake to it, right? Like, this is one of the places I end up is like, yeah, we should refuse uptake to it. I mean, you're asking, like, is that properly called gaslighting? And given what I've said here, it looks like it is, if it's apt, right? I've said like anger gaslighting behavior is persistent, pervasive refusal to uptake apt anger. So I have a sort of easy out here, which is to say, well, if the anger is not apt, then it doesn't count as gaslighting. So fine, I'll just say it's not gaslighting. However, the substance of the question is like, shouldn't we be getting that person to doubt the aptness of their anger? Yes, I think we should, right? Like, I think it's inapt anger and they should be doubting it. But I think this also gets at this other set of questions. It's about what are the right sorts of uptake refuse? What's the right response to, in some ways, this goes where the tantrum question is going to. Right? Like, yeah, there's a tantrum. Indeed, you should doubt your emotional competency about your anger, your sense of injustice. If you're getting angry at justice, it demands for justice. But yeah, you might think that we want a response that is sort of oriented toward not just getting you to doubt your competency, but also repairing your competency. What does that look like? So yeah, I think it's not gaslighting according to what I've said here. Yes, I think you should try and get them to doubt their anger competency. But I think there are also some difficult questions about what exactly that looks like. Does that look exactly like the sort of refused uptake that I described here? Yeah, like I want to know what that uptake work looks like. I haven't figured it out fully yet.
Yeah, this is from Roy Roth. After reading your earlier article, I was surprised to hear in the talk of emotions that we still need to have, that emotions still need to have objects to be relevant, and that emotions are still a subject to a criteria of aptness. Doesn't the continental reassessment of intentionality give us a different way to characterize the affective economy? Can't I pause to celebrate my own emotions internally before I then direct them toward worldly objectives? And shouldn't the other person start by acknowledging my emotions as legitimate internally before continuing on to acknowledging the aptness of the worldly object or of the object of it?
I don't know. I mean, this goes to the sort of, this is another way of sort of bringing up this question about that you asked about what you were calling sort of internally oriented affects. So where I am at right now on this is that I am really interested in thinking about thinking about different intentional structures. I am really interested in that sort of existential phenomenological work on emotions that actually is thinking about the different structures of intentionality that are going on in them. I do think that affects can become disoriented from their objects. So far, the ways that I have thought about that have been in terms of ways that that is part of a sort of injurious effect, right? A way that sometimes it's a kind of, it can be a kind of injury to have your anger get, you could get gaslit about your anger in a way that sort of unmoors your anger from its objects. And you could find yourself to be kind of dispositionally angry in a way that has sort of like the force of that anger persists, but its sense has been disintegrated. Its sort of intentional sense, that relationship of subject object has been disintegrated. I mean, I think this is a challenging direction for me to think about, right? Like, do we want to go in this direction where we think about cases where like, no, that's not just damage. There are cases where we want to think about sort of non-intentional affective states in a way that's part of our story about what matters to us about our affects and emotions. I don't know. I used to be, I'm not sure what I'm doing. You can do that. And it's not what I did today. And I will think about the ways that it constitutes a challenge to what I'm doing. But for the most part, I think that there can be just sort of two different projects there.
Okay, well, I want you to join me in thanking both of our speakers. Thanks again.